I just wanted to welcome everyone to this webinar. So this is, the meeting that we have as Ambilly Advisory, part of the series on sustainable investment in the mining sector and sustainable development goals objective that we do with the Emerging Market Investors Alliance. We had the pleasure to do a series of different events for people that follow us on a regular basis, on community participation, on indigenous communities, on the relationship between mining companies and transparency of supply chains with especially the Modern Slavery Act in the UK and the impact that it has on both investors and mining companies, and the positive impact also that you can have on the ground. And so this is another one of those events, and I want to really thank our friends here, from obviously Monica Ospina, Sheila Khama, Geipel, and Gosia Nowakowska-Miller. We're going to have Laurent de Soultrait join us also. The entire idea here is obviously to always try to have constructive conversation from different side of the question, having obviously practitioners inside companies, but also experts from academia, sometimes member of community discuss on those topics. And I think we have a wonderful panel today. I encourage everyone in the audience to actually, I see Laurent is joining right now. That's wonderful. I encourage everyone to ask questions in the chat at the same time. I'll try to pick them up at the same time or during this webinar, or if not, we'll just come back to you and try to address your specific question or your specific interest. Our main objective here is to share best practices and listen from our experts. As I was mentioning, and maybe if I introduce each one, one by one. We'll start with, Gosia Nowakowska-Miller from IFC, who's going to help me, set the stage for, the main debates and what we talk about when we talk about local content. This is actually very likely to be one of many, panels on local content, in the next coming month, because it's a very wide topic, obviously. Then we have Jeff Geipel from Mining Share Value, that has obviously the experience of monitoring, the local content supply chains and being able to work with extractive industries on selecting and working with local companies on the ground. So Ambilly Advisory does the same thing, so we work often together. Laurent de Soultrait from Total is also joining us, so thank you, Laurent, for coming. Head of local content and industrial strategy at Total Group. We have Monica Ospina also from Trade in Toronto. Worked with Monica many years in Colombia, in Ecuador, good expertise on the ground. And Sheila Khama, I'm delighted to have Sheila on board. We will bring her experience at, former CEO at De Beers Botswana, but, really now, as she's mentioning, dedicating her retirement years to developing best practices on local content, publishing books and a series of studies on this. So I, really do invite you to also visit her specific website on local content. This is really a way for us to share, ideas and best practices. And I'm happy to have you on board for this event. So maybe just to turn and set the stage, right away on this. And we have expertise from all, different cities: Toronto, Harare, Paris, London. I miss my city of Paris. I'm very happy to see Laurent today. But we're going to be addressing a series of topics. Maybe Gosia, first, if I can turn to you. So my idea here is maybe to try to have maybe a high-level view on the debates on local content, especially over the last, few years, and especially since COVID, basically, on what you've seen the main trends to be, and what IFC you're working on in terms of helping or supporting, collaboration between actors in the question of local content in the extractive sectors world. And you're on mute, Gosia. You're starting perfectly.
It's because we spoke about that so much. It was so apologies. But thank you very much, Remy, for the invitation, first of all. And I'm really pleased and flattered to be on this panel of all these distinguished speakers, many friends and a few new faces. So this is wonderful. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with IFC, IFC is part of the World Bank Group. It's the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. So IFC invests in large-scale projects across the globe in developing countries, and I'm part of a team that complements those investments with advisory services. So we work with our clients to support them, particularly in areas where they have challenges with communities, community expectations, and that often leads to local supplier development. So that's why I've been working on local supplier development for way too many years at IFC, and so So I guess, as Laurent said, to set the stage, when we speak about local content, you have local content supplier development, but also workforce development. So those two go hand in hand, of course, because it's all about skills and capacity building. I guess when we started doing local content or local supplier development, probably over 15 years ago, a lot of it was driven by social license, community expectations, and managing those risks around social license and community expectations. And so companies didn't know how to address those. So we started advising them about, local economic development and making the local business as part of their supply chain. Of course, this started leading to governments having policies and regulations around local content to kind of require it. So it became a compliance issue beyond just a social license. But really at the core of it, it should be a business issue. It should have a strong business case and to really anchor it to the business of the company, whichever company it may be. And that's where we often struggle with the procurement teams and the community teams and the CEOs that may have grand visions, but it's hard to trickle it down because procurement often goes against what local content is trying to encourage. More suppliers with lower capacity, so you have to provide training to them, and so it becomes a struggle. What we're seeing in the extractive sector now, local content is sort of just part of the menu of work that we do regularly. It doesn't seem something unexpected. Everyone plans for it from early on in the project design and so on. But what we're seeing at IFC is we're transferring all that experience to other sectors, to hydro, to transport, and so on. These issues are not unique to extractives. Clearly, sectors like car manufacturing for decades have been doing this in places like Brazil, South Africa, ensuring that there's local content in the various components that are manufactured in those countries. But now it's becoming more and more the sort of the community expectations, or the people have found their voices and they're making their voices heard and their expectations heard. There's a lot of economic issues that are driving this. So often youth are at the core of this. So a lot of our work is really focusing on how to engage with youth, how to create those economic opportunities for youth. And of course in disadvantaged groups, which that often means gender, and ensuring that there's inclusiveness in the supply chain and so on. And so I don't want to keep going on about this because there's so many other speakers here, but for me, the core is the business case for the company, but also competitiveness. And I think that's a word we often forget to use when we speak about local content, because we're so focused on compliance, or we're focused on just social license, but we can't achieve any of our objectives in local content until we find competitive local businesses. And that takes a lot of work. And that's where so many of us are kind of focused on our efforts and so on. So I look forward to hearing everyone else's comments and insights and experiences. So I'll leave it at that in order not to consume too much of everyone's time. Thank you.
I appreciate very much, Gosia, and obviously when we actually put together, preparing for this webinar, we're thinking about how to address the question of local content, where to take it from, and how to highlight the main, structural elements and evolution in terms of engaging with, basically a territory. And you mentioned ideas of the relation with community relations specifically, because that has become a key element of the building towards social license to operate. We'll bring that up a little later in this webinar. And it also tackles a series of demands from investors and from companies and from consumers to make sure that there's responsible sourcing of minerals or energy sources. The question of transparency is always key. And you see me coming, Jeff, I'm going to be transitioning to you on this. But when you actually look at how to increase the transparency on those supply chains, how to be able to track, or to track would be the back term, but to engage more profoundly in terms of with the local entrepreneurs, and being able to provide a series of services to the industry, but also building in diversification, basically being the seed capital or the off-taker for other economic sectors to grow. How does transparency basically bring more value and in terms of the monitoring of suppliers and the quality of local content in the short, mid, and long run, actually?
Thanks so much for having me today. And I mean, I think your question speaks to where we're at in this long quest for increasing local content in host countries. We've all been doing this in one way or the other for a very long time, but we haven't necessarily had much tracking or measuring of progress. And so we've seen a lot of countries put in local procurement regulations, and yet, very few of them actually publicly report out on what's going on. What has been successful, what is not. There are some exceptions. I mean, Nigeria has been doing quite a lot of overt public outreach on their efforts. The Ghana Minerals Commission recently made some statistics public in terms of what they've accomplished, or what they say they've accomplished with their local content regulations. But I mean, the obvious point is you can't measure what you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think we need to get to the point now where the next step is for companies to report on what they're doing on local procurement, how much they're spending, where it's going, and governments to take that information in and use it to inform policy and investments.
No, great. And actually, when you're looking at different countries, maybe just a follow-up before I reach out to Sheila, but when you're looking at different jurisdictions, obviously you mentioned Nigeria, we're seeing a series of new regulations that are coming to the stage. I mean, different, whether in Africa or in Latin America, specifically Guyana right now, taking the Ghana example in terms of how to operate on local content, especially in the energy space. Would you actually highlight one specific country in terms of recent development that would be engaging, maybe in a different way, more innovative way, and to you more sustained way on an inclusive development and support to companies also operate and need to actually see the result of it? Would you be able to highlight one or two?
Great. I hope my internet seems to be a little bit choppy, so I hope I'm coming through all right. But
you're coming out perfect.
In any event, I mean, I think that, okay. What I would say is that the jury is kind of in on whether we need regulation or not. I mean, we do need some. We know that if you leave it entirely to the market, it won't necessarily work. So we know that we kind of solved that no regulation is probably not the way to go. But we also know that unrealistic targets don't work. We also know that governments need capacity to be able to actually manage this. So we know that sort of there's a midpoint where we need to get to, and maybe the debate now is, where is that midpoint? I'm not against all targets, but I am against sort of across the board targets where a country just says you must buy 70% local, and that figure is not based on any reality or any understanding. And this goes back to that data point. You need to understand what the current level is, and then maybe if the current level is 45%, maybe a target of 46% makes sense. But we're not seeing targets set in that manner, and that's the problem. So what I would say in the short term is I do really believe this idea of governments requiring companies to submit a local procurement plan, and for the companies to work with the government on the execution of those plans, I think is really a successful way forward. And we've seen some success with that. I mean, Ghana has this list of goods and services that they've put on this list of set-asides, and they made a national supplier development program. Where it did work was where they actually put some effort into it. They, on the production of cables, it went very well, but they didn't necessarily put a lot of effort in aside from a few products. And I think, the collaborative approach is what works, but you also need to resource it. You need to follow up. You need to connect finance to suppliers. You need to have training workshops. And I think that's the way forward, is to really make a collaborative approach. And, maybe if you are going to use targets and sticks, use them very, very selectively for one product or two products in particular, and then match them with adequate finance and support. So that's kind of how I would look at it.
No, very good. And obviously, since we talk about latest trends and we're going to be talking about innovation in the second part of this webinar, obviously we have to take into account the obvious pandemics currently and the impact that COVID-19 has had on the capacity of companies to interact with their suppliers, interact with their community, be able to sustain a series of projects that they had before with new costs, obviously, with a series of biosecurity protocols when you actually engage or enter on the mining sites, or also a series of protocols with quality we're seeing with the suppliers. Maybe Sheila, I'm going to reach out to you here. You've been specifically working recently on regulations and situation in Congo. Obviously, the case of Botswana when there was no local content policy and you were CEO of the beers. and other countries around. Can you maybe just give us a little bit of a review of the impact of COVID-19, the pandemics, on the local supply chain quality and the regulation of local content?
Yes, well, thank you very much. I mean, I think the way to see the impact, if you just take overall, is to say that both the local content momentum and the scale of the supply chain, the momentum has been slowed down, the scale has been shrunk. That would be about as high level as you can. But then when you get into the details, one has to then look and recognize that the petroleum sector is not the mining sector. In the context of COVID-19 in the petroleum sector came on the back of the collapse of the oil prices. And so there was already a downward trend with respect to the movement of goods. But in addition to that, petroleum as a source of energy was impacted because as people stayed home, as there were travel bans, the consumption of energy-related petroleum products dropped significantly. And so that meant a further result of shrinkage in the supply chain. And particularly as countries in Africa and elsewhere took a decision to restrict movement in the workplace, that also meant that as businesses were interrupted and the level of activity went down, so then did demand. Mm-hmm. So in a way, the way to see COVID-19 and its impact is to see it through the response of the markets to the commodities and what that did to demand. The actions of governments in terms of emergency measures aimed at reducing chances of infection and what that did to local manufacturing, local consumption, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the oil and gas space, air travel ban, the decline in consumption of jet fuel was phenomenal, and so forth and so forth. If you look at mining, so I think of myself as a miner, and often I have trouble when people talk about the mining industry, because in truth, there is no mining industry. There is the coal industry, there is the diamond industry, there is the gold industry. And so COVID-19 brought this to bear even more so, because depending on sustained demand for a certain commodity, the level of disruption was nominal. So if we take gold, gold did exceptionally well, both in prices, export and everything, despite COVID, but also because of the way that gold moves between markets. By the same token, you can look at other high value but low volume commodities. But then when you look at other mineral products that needed to move by rail and to be handled at ports, when the port closed, so naturally, that presented a major problem. And in the case of the DRC, cobalt was affected, not because there was no demand, on the contrary, there was sustained demand in China. But first you had to get them out of the DRC, get them to the South African depot port, and then move them over. And without that unblockage, what that meant was that, at least from the supply chain perspective, there was a lot of bottlenecks. Local content programs themselves, it depended on the country and the industry. Say, for instance, in Nigeria, they instituted a state of emergency, but the government, through its local content board, put several stimuli packages to help what they call the 100 companies. And so they were able to mitigate the potential impact. Algeria did the same, other countries didn't. So the short answer is that there was a lot of shrinkage. Everyone was affected in some form or another. It varied depending on how hot or not hot the commodity market was and what interventions the host country and the investors took. So it's sort of a mixed bag. No, but I'm looking forward to hearing what Laurent has to say.
So I'm actually going to be, bridging to Laurent, and actually, making a very interesting point in terms of looking at it from, commodity to commodity. I mean, each sector or subsector actually is regulated by a series of different actors in a way, and provides different best practices. And we we contribute to the responsible gold mining principles, for example, that was put together by the World Gold Council, which is interesting in terms of some of its content for local content, well, some of its recommendations, and those can actually serve sometimes as blueprint for other minerals, or even in terms of the energy sector. You see me coming, Laura, I'm on my way towards you. In terms of when you look at over the last 4 to 5 years, the best practices in terms of local content, community relations have been often done into the mining sector, because the commodity prices were probably higher at the time. There was probably more needs in terms of community relations. However, there are also new technological tools and new processes from the energy sector that are implemented. I see we had a quick comment from someone in Maputo. I know Total is a huge actor in Mozambique, specifically with a key project in the north of the country, and is all around Africa and some countries outside of Africa, obviously also. But what would you, according to you, Laurent, be the best practices that you have implemented over the last 4 to 5 years at Total? If you can give us maybe a little vision of how you address this question from the perspective of an extremely large and innovative energy player.
Okay, thank you. First, there's no one single answer to that question, because obviously local content is local, and it really depends on local regulation, which sometimes does not exist. We may speak only of expectations, and laws may be very detailed, with operating modes extremely detailed and constraining, and other are quite widely open to discussion. Or some laws may be very prescriptive in terms of targets, others not. So you have a wide array of possibilities. That means that you cannot rely or base your approach on what the regulation will say, or not only base the approach on what it will say, but develop your own philosophy, basically, and your own methodology, and be quite flexible. So, of course, it's a question of being compliant, but it's we have first 2 objectives that we always keep in mind. Whatever we do is first keep under control the operational risks, and throughout the entire supply chain that we will control, okay, or try to control. So it's a matter of identifying very factually and objectively the local capacities, the local risks, the flex up possibilities, I would say, and imagine how to mitigate the risks. So you have cost risks, capex risks, I would say. Local content can be a project killer. Quality risks, planning or delays risks, and of course reputational risks. And we all know projects that I will not name that have suffered from billions, hundreds of millions or billions of reputational damages. Okay, so our first task is to make a full analysis of what's feasible, where the risks are, so that to keep everything under control. And the second objective is, I would say, to optimize or to maximize the impact we may have, so that not to be in just a short-term tactical compliance exercise. And we may, in some countries, we may have a succession of projects. Imagine Angola or Nigeria. We've been present in those countries for decades with a succession of projects. So you can base or build projects after projects, the quantity of local content and the local capacities. And then you can benefit at the end of the day from those increased capacities. And that's a good thing. So it's a question of maximizing the local impact, okay? So that's the second objective. And I would say that if this is well done, we benefit from more opportunities, and we can benefit our supply chain from more opportunities. It's a question of also looking at this constraint as an opportunity, which is a word, but it's also a philosophy. So you look long-term, not short-term. That's a way to frame your mind, okay? You seek constant alignment with the authorities and with all the stakeholders that can work with you, including your suppliers, to build up capacities. You collaborate to reduce costs. You do that with a lot of anticipation, and you try to bring innovation, because I mean the conditions are nowadays no longer the same than, let's say, 10 years ago. Okay, the prices are not the same, and you need to look for the oil and gas in the most much more expensive ways. Okay, so all that ends up in some sort of specifications that you give to each of your suppliers. Okay, and you have your strategy. Without any strategy, you cannot think long term. Okay, you need to have a long-term view. So you have your plans, and you split your objectives into specifications that will differ from supplier between different suppliers. And it's a question then that's a very I would say tricky exercise. And this is what one of the ladies who spoke earlier, probably Gosia, yeah. We, us local content managers, I would say, we are faced with a lot of internal contradictions, internal oppositions from CNP managers who think short term, including from project directors who want just to deliver, including from the authorities who are interested sometimes into only in short term. And at the end of the day, the profitability. So we need to find our way with good specifications that are cascaded down from tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. Okay?
Yes, and I think
so this is the way we proceed, basically.
No, very good, and thank you for this introductory remarks on this, and we'll follow up specifically on technology and innovation with you afterwards. And I mentioned that because there's a few questions and mentions on the chat on those things. Okay. But maybe reaching out to Monica, I mean, and Laurent did a very good introduction of how corporate actors see it from a risk perspective, the above the ground risk, with reputational being, an increasing risk on this level. You look at it a little more, from the impact on the ground perspective, and how to include, local content in terms of, overall inclusive development, especially in a mining area of influence, or next to some energy projects. I know a lot of your work in Colombia or in Ecuador. I know Sheila was also working in Colombia, so that we have a lot of expertise also towards Latin America here. Can you maybe just give us an example of successful collaboration with other sectors and the impact on inclusive development from the presence in the mid to long run of an extractive industries company?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Remi, for the invite. Well, basically, I will start by saying that when you talk about local content, you talk about the top of engagement, and that is when you both suppliers and companies reach the point that they trust each other to be part of the same business. So we cannot separate that. And Laurent make a very good point about risk management. So I will say both a successful engagement process will lead to a successful local content planning program, and equally the same, a successful social management system will lead to a successful risk management program. Both go hand to hand, and we cannot separate that. So when we just go at a much granulated level at on the ground, which is much more the work that we do at Ospina is really at boots on the ground, is literally how we recognize that we shape bridges for a period of time with extractive industries there. And this goes very well together in understanding and manages expectations. So if it's a mine that will have a lifetime of 10 years, you already are planning from day one how far you can go 10 years in terms of the engagement of those suppliers, if it's direct sourcing, or indirectly how much they can diversify in their local economy. For example, metal fabrication. Metal fabrication can go that far in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years of a lifetime of a project, and probably this can move to construction, infrastructure, or other services. I have worked in creating different supply chains, and it goes attached to something that probably we're going to tackle later about capacity mapping. Mm-hmm. And the question that is in the panel from Breno Madeiros is exactly that. you really need to go into understanding what is the capacity of the local level in terms of infrastructure, human capital, and at the same time of the project itself. The value of extractives here in terms of the inclusion and diversity comes into the opportunity of integrate a region around a larger project. It's not the only opportunity, which has been the challenge in many regions in the world, that they just see the project as the only opportunity, and the opportunity lasts for the time it lasts, and after we see a collapse in the local economies, which is precisely one of the challenges that local content you can fix if you just think on diversification and inclusion. And inclusion comes to recognizing from a very small micro enterprises and the capacity of production they have, to probably a larger player at the regional or national level, who has the power of subcontracting along the supply chain too. And we can not only limit that to the local content, to the nuclear area of influence that is exactly that little town. Local content as a region is a multiplier effect of opportunities, and also a multiplier effect of capacity that has to be built, new industries that can be developed besides, and the opportunity of many other people to create not only employment, but the opportunity to bring technology and innovation to that.
Yeah, and
so,
you mentioned, thank you very much, Monica. You mentioned, the multiplier effect, which is, exactly what I want to bring to the to Gosia for the next question. I mean, obviously, you also mentioned, managing expectations. We've seen, a series of mining projects, of energy projects. Obviously, when you look at a country like Guyana, for example, I mentioned it twice, or Ecuador, Peru, in terms of mining, these expectations towards the extractive sector that is basically, supposed to solve all the problems, sometimes fill the gap of the absence of the state, and therefore there's so many expectations that are geared towards, the potentiality of local content there. Well, in truth, the entire objective is to be a multiplier, basically being a pioneer, an off-taker, engaging into a series of actors that have been clearly vetted, clearly identified as potentially having the capacity in the mid to the long run to be a partner on the ground of the project itself, but supporting, its capacity of entering new markets or developing new technology for its own standalone development without the extractive project. So that there's a few ways to quantify this, there's a few ways to identify that. And I'm turning maybe to Gosia, because the importance that we were talking to about the multipliers, to just realize and make the case sometimes to governmental actors or to other stakeholders of the importance and the capacity of the extractive sectors to build local content for other sectors. I mean, whether it's the automotive sectors, when it's the logistics sectors, the capacity of a large project to integrate into a territory and build already the first tracks towards local content for other industries is something that has brought benefits to a series of countries. And Gosia, you wanted to provide a few words on this topic. And you're still muted. Yes, you're not muted anymore. Good.
Yes, I think the extractive sector can be a catalyst for a lot of this work. A lot of attention is brought to it. The projects are often very large, not always, especially mining projects can be smaller, but usually when these sort of large companies come in with new investments, everyone's wanting to leverage this as an economic opportunity. So all the attention is there. And so it's a good way to galvanize lots of stakeholders together around the topic of why hasn't there been economic development? What are the deficiencies? What are the obstacles? What's standing in the way for the local businesses to be more competitive? And if that's and if those dialogues happen in a collaborative way, it can really open up lots of ways to tackle these issues, because it isn't just the Ministry of Petroleum or Mines or Natural Resources that can solve these issues or should be the only advocate for them. You need the Ministry of Education, you need the Ministry of Finance, you need everyone working to solve all these market failures that exist as to why local businesses haven't been able to become competitive enough in order to just naturally bid for contracts and win them compared to international bidders. So it's one person can't solve the issue, and also one sector can't do it. So we've had projects where we of course work at the sector level, so we try to work through chambers of mines or chambers of commerce, so that the attention isn't only on that new entrant into the market, because that's the shiny new toy and everyone wants to pay attention to them. But we've also worked across sectors. I mean, an old project in Mozambique, Moslink, where we had Mosal, the aluminum smelter, was our client, but then we had Coca-Cola, we had Cervecería de Mozambique involved, we had there was another client. So it was multiple sectors who all needed suppliers locally. Yes, this was in Maputo, so of course it's a larger kind of cosmopolitan center, but they all needed logistics. They all needed, you know, different types of services and so on, and they worked together. They collaborated, as we were talking. Collaboration is so key, to leverage your resources, to leverage the funding so it goes further. And I think Extractives has a lot to teach other industries. There's a lot of learning that has come through the extractives industries, and all the ups and downs, all the sort of the Extractives has battled this out. There's been a lot of successes, but there's been a lot of criticisms as well, and not always rightly so. It's been a lot of attention. So I think it's an opportunity now, and COVID has brought this also, I think, to everyone's attention, the need for local capabilities, because many countries just depend on imports. And COVID made everyone realize that we need to be more self-sufficient. And how do we make that happen? It's not an easy, it doesn't happen overnight. Manufacturing capabilities don't just appear from nowhere because somebody wanted it. So you need power, it's a lot of infrastructure that also needs to function properly. So the one good out of all the negative that COVID has had, it's woken people up to how to become more self-sufficient and self-reliant in many ways, personally, business-wise, and so on. And I think I'll leave it at that and let others add in their experiences.
No, that's very interesting. And when we talk about, interacting with governments, interacting with other sectors, building collaboration between sectors to be efficient. I think Monica brought this. There's a lot of work that is done also with Devonshire initiative of building cross-sectoral collaboration in terms of building, joint strategy, especially in local contents. So, step by step tutorial. I'm happy to share it, for everyone. But I'd like to maybe bridge to Jeff. We mentioned the impact of COVID. Obviously, we mentioned also, and I believe for me, maybe the silver lining to this crisis is actually it opens a lot of opportunity to implement new ways of monitoring the implementation, the step-by-step, agreements, following up with suppliers, and also, interact differently with governmental actors in terms of shaping regulations and question of quotas, question of the type of subsectors that is impacted. More importantly, question of knowledge management and training. How do you see, in terms of this game here and of shaping up the right regulation, how do you see this developing in the next few days, especially with the integration of new technological tools?
I mean, I think COVID is, obviously it's changed everything. And one of the things that's changed is it's completely exposed the problems with just-in-time inventory systems for corporations. It's shown that some areas, in particular parts of Africa, are completely dangerously dependent on Chinese imports and that kind of thing. So there's a huge sort of things that were sort of obvious to people like us who work in supply chains all day long became a lot more obvious to the public. And no one even knew what PPE stood for until COVID, and now everyone knows. But we always knew that because of our work in mining.
We were the pioneers of the field, you see.
Yeah, exactly. So what I would say there is that the advantage now is that companies now have much more of a self-interest in supporting local suppliers. If you were relying on a consulting firm from Australia to fly in to give you advice on whatever issue it was, they're not coming in anytime soon. So now you're less productive because you've been waiting for a consulting firm. I talked to one mining company. They said that their best drillers are expats, and they haven't been able to get to the country since day one. And they genuinely believe they're down productivity-wise, a few percent. So there's a real business case to hedge now and build up local suppliers, build up local talent in a way that wasn't there. So I think there's an alignment there that the governments and companies can work together on. And I think, again, this goes back to the same thing, you know, it probably gets boring me saying it, but we need the data. You need to know which products are the ones that are susceptible to supply chain shortages. You need to know which ones are ideal for targeting, and that's where we need to get to. And if you don't have that, what will end up happening is governments will probably just guess at which products, right? And we need to understand, if you look at the example of PPE, there should be a survey about how much PPE is being purchased by all the mining companies, all the healthcare industry. You know, you add that number up, and then you determine, okay, that means we need 1 factory or 2 factories. I mean, you can't decide if the factory is going to work unless you know that there's X amount of demand in the first place. So that's what I would say, is that there's a huge opportunity. COVID should nudge things in a little bit of a positive way on supply chains. And the first step is a really good baseline of where we're at.
No, wonderful. And just to rebound on this before I reach out to Sheila on the local supply development programs and all that has been, you know, new coming to the equation recently. On your element of we need the data. I mean, obviously, you know, I'm not going to be opposed to this in terms of, you know, being an academic to start with, but, you know, for me, I think the key element here is not only to shape on, you know, the quantitative data. Obviously, it is in terms of, you know, being able to see what are the capacity for commercialization, what is the potentially for trickling down your growth with the seed, you know, investment into the subsector. But it's also a lot of qualitative data and being able to look at, you know, the capacity of management to follow up, you know, mid to long run, a series of interviews and discussion, you know, usually third parties that are better sometimes to engage on this, than being the very large mining company or very large, you know, energy company engaging directly with potential suppliers. But I think we're also seeing here not the shift on qualitative data and understanding of the protocols, understanding of what are the gaps. And we're going to go into collaboration mapping and with Monica eventually, but what are the gaps to fill through the qualitative knowledge of the jurisdiction itself. And that's where I see a lot of the recent, you know, local content development programs I've been focusing, you know, more lately. Maybe Sheila, if you can take it from here, because I know you've been doing a lot of work with this actually with Gosia in West Africa also, and in other jurisdictions. You know, where do you see those large initiatives of local content supplier programs, development programs, you know, geared towards in the future, and how do they shape the future of local content? Sheila, you're on mute. Yeah.
So, I mean, if one reflects on, say, 20 years ago, local content was a straight line, and it was a sentence in a law: you must procure 80%, bang. And somebody thought that was the magic bullet. And then we progressively learned, actually, it doesn't work like that. There are aspects of safety, health, and so forth that need to be brought to bear. But then we also understood that there was capacity. And then we understood also that actually it is a partnership between the investor and the host government. And so we have seen this aggressive migration and an incremental understanding of what underlines a successful supplier development and local content program. Where it stands now is more and more people are recognizing that it is flawed for government to presume that a local content policy or law is the responsibility of the Minister of Petroleum, but actually this is a trade and industry policy, and that's where it sits. Mm-hmm. And that, if we see it that way, we are starting off on the right foot, and we are doing the sort of things that everybody has mentioned, which is that extractive then just becomes a flywheel. But that the bigger picture is to use that to integrate and develop a, if you wish, critical mass of skills, grow the local market. And with that, then you have backed the trend and migrated from the resource scarce space where you were dependent on one commodity to using it really to leverage and diversify and grow the economy. That, I think, is where the mindset is now, that fundamental understanding. What is lacking is the capacity to translate that into something that works for most countries. A few countries have succeeded, like Nigeria. They have a fairly well-established national content development board with aspects from financing to monitoring to evaluation. which allows the entire pipeline of being able to design and implement. You also have countries where, interestingly, the government is not the driver, but the footprint of the mining industry is so big, and there's enough vested interest for local content to succeed. And in this case, South Africa, through Anglo-American, becomes an example. 30 years ago, Anglo-American used this diversified portfolio basically to drive before most people were talking about local content. Now, at that time, it seemed like it might be elitist. So to your question, where are we now? Now local content, because in the past, the question was, is local content for the elite and the political elite and those who are part of the ruling class, or are we using it as a vehicle to obtain the license to operate? More and more it's seen as a vehicle for the license to operate, which means we are now moving local content from the cities in the industries to industries in the vicinity of the operations, because that is where the rubber hits the road, literally. And so we are seeing also that migration. This is interesting because if you factor in COVID, we've come full circle where for multinational corporations, local content was almost counterintuitive to the notion of economies of scale where you would centralize your supply chain. With the experience we've now seen in COVID, that if you have your supply chain away from your profit, guess what? To Jeff's point, you might not be able to get that geologist to go and work with the drillers to extract ore and do exploration. So logic says, all of a sudden, local content becomes a value proposition for investors. The question now is, how do governments make this very clear value proposition that with the advent of pandemics and other disruptors, now our reality, what do governments do to very quickly get companies to relocate their procurement and other supply chain modalities? And the question is critical because if history teaches anything, is that this opportunity is not going to last forever. Mm-hmm. Guess what? There's some other disruptor in the backyard changing this formula as we speak, and that person is called the fourth industrial revolution, because guess what? You can make it anywhere and deliver it anywhere. So we are seeing changes. Now we're waiting for governments to move quickly enough to leverage and lead the conversation, or let once again industry lead the conversation and have host governments cry foul. That, I think, is what I'm waiting for. But perhaps history will prove me wrong.
And I think that that's very interesting. I mean, we mentioned the fourth industrial revolution, and that's obviously linked with digitalization of those processes. Something that I'd like to bring to the attention of Laurent, so that he actually, explains how, integrating new tools and platform, you can actually be more effective on a series of countries. But you mentioned something which I think is very relevant: the fact that it really has been integrated into the idea of social license to operate. Basically, a clear incentives also for investors to understand that there is, support on the ground. There are, the right protocol to build alliances and follow up alliances, with local stakeholders to generate additional, economic growth outside of the mining or energy sphere. And that is really what actually will support the capacity of the project to move forward without, blockade or strikes or whichever. Even in this, I mean, there's a series of platforms that exist. A Citizen Lab, one of our partners actually has a social media platform for mining territory, and that we develop with them and energy territory to be able to get a sense of what are the opportunities and what are the capacity to reach out towards more inclusive developments. I know Total is working with a series of different networks, especially in Africa, to be able to understand, what are the key elements of local content, what are the key priorities or opportunities to be able to support another actor in one of the countries that they operate. Actually, Laurent, maybe I can actually rebound on this and then turn to you and ask you, what have you seen with this digitization of trends? Whether you're looking at community relations, you're looking at local content processes, you're looking at, supplier selections and management of knowledge. What has changed for you with this digitization of those?
Okay. Well, that's something which is not new, but the way we address the topic is new. because we have digital roadmaps, for instance, now. So that it's a way to recognize that it's an important matter. So, for instance, our global procurement activity at Total has a digital roadmap. Okay, so for us, digitalization, it's a value enabler, as it will bring you simplification, enhanced productivity, quality of service, increased control possibilities, including capacity building possibilities. And for instance, in the orbit of local content, there are some existing activities and some that could be developed. Well, first, registration of local companies. This is a major issue we're faced with when entering a country. Who are the local companies? Which are the local companies? Able, not able, etc. So depending on the countries, you have existing databases or not. Okay, so digitalization here can bring some value for us, for local companies. Pre-qualification of companies through digitalization. Informing local companies of what's ahead. You cannot always organize social events in physical gatherings, okay? Especially in the COVID situation. So that enhances the possibility to inform and to gather people. Enhance possibilities to train companies. And the good thing is it enables you to do it well before FID.
Yes.
It takes time to train someone. It takes time to train companies. And when the FID is pronounced, it's a rush. And more often it's, well, companies are the one who could have been trained or who could be ready are not ready, okay? So they're not ready to bid successfully in the tenders, for instance, or to create consortiums to bid jointly in tenders. So that enhances those possibilities. So you have social capacities to bring together different companies and to identify who the potential partners could be. As we said, digitalization in the process of biddings, but now that's something which is very mundane because it's fully admitted. Enhanced possibilities to structure and to accelerate your local content reporting, which is a very compliant, it's a big pain, you know, this local content reporting. So it can accelerate the process of verifying the data, controlling the data, etc. Including, we spoke of having impact. You need to demonstrate the impact you have. So at the end of the day, everything can be monetized, whether it's employment, it's training, etc. Everything can be converted into a monetary value and into GDP, you know, impact. So you can accelerate the process of proving what you do. So there are plenty of possibilities, but many of them are not even existing. They exist in other activities. We could have the oil and gas Tinder, okay, or the oil and gas Mythic. We don't have it, okay. It hardly exists. It exists, but hardly exists.
Development, and I can assure you that, and I'm looking at Jeff, and I'm sure he has something cooking, and I have something cooking also on this. But we're coming with the oil and gas Tinder.
Okay. Okay. So plenty of possibilities. I think that we are just at the beginning of what could be done. And imagine the revolution that the cell phones have brought in Africa compared to physical phone lines. We may be at the beginning of the same kind of revolution to help local companies to to size opportunities and to develop their capacities, to find partners. Well, there are plenty of opportunities.
Yeah, we're seeing this complete trend, and even on our work with the communities, or we're on local content strategy, of everything is switched to the platforms that we have, which is a social media platform for companies, but also through the use of WhatsApp and cell phones in areas where connectivity is more limited. A lot of investors actually have not prejudiced ideas on Africa on some jurisdictions, but actually I remember starting my career in the cell phone business 20 years ago, and already seeing with Orange, for example, as a French operator in Africa, all the tendencies towards, you know, the payments processes, the billing through already, you know, the GSM system. So actually, Africa might have been a front runner and a pioneer on all those processes, and that now support the capacity to digitize a lot of those trends and processes in terms of local content today. That brings me to maybe just before, Monica, I'm going to ask you specifically about the capacity mapping, which was a key element that, you know, Laurent brought here. Before that, I just wanted maybe to mention, don't hesitate. I see you're already answering a series of questions on the chat or on the Q&A. For people in your attendance that feel that they might have an additional question, feel free to send me an email and I'll just relay to other people if we haven't addressed this. We might not have a lot of time to finish, so we're just going to be quickly saying, you know, closing words from each of the panelists after Monica, and we might finish, you know, 10 after, you know, after the hour. But feel free, we really want to have this as an interactive tool, so just send me an email and I'll follow up afterwards. Monica, I'm just going to you on this idea of capacity mapping, you know, how I'm going to step by step of the cross-sectoral collaboration elements of seeing the capacities, then building the consortium that, you know, Laurent was mentioning, and then following up maybe with the use of brokers or you know, third parties that can actually, you know, with a political science mind frame, negotiation mind frame, follow up on the different, you know, ideas of the implementation of the agreement. Can you actually, you know, give more ideas of how this, you know, collaboration mapping, capacity mapping can be very helpful for extractive industries and authorities in the territory? And you're on mute.
Mute.
Yes.
Okay, again. Well, basically the whole concept of the capacity mapping was to really understand who to engage, what to engage, how to engage, and why. What does it mean? This is that when we work in capacity mapping, we have designed a model that basically creates the data of the local areas and goes according to different rings to reach different regions, even at the national level, if we want to comply that level. But the point critical here is that we really need to have a good understanding, and Sheila make a good point about how far the private sector can go and how much the responsibility of the government is. And we're only not talking about the Ministry of Natural Resources, just to put a big umbrella, whatever it is. But, and Gosia was highlighting that this is a role of Ministry of Education, Commerce, Trade, even Health comes into place. So when we see capacity mapping, we assess the infrastructure for education to bring the capacity to people to the classroom, infrastructure in terms of transportation, roads, access. We talk about infrastructure for electricity, power, because there are other different sectors that you might want to develop in the region, but there is no infrastructure capacity that allow them to develop to the level that is expected. And Gosia was making a very important point about being competitive, and we forget about that. And so many countries, sadly, they think that the success of local content is have 100 companies registered. No, the success of local content is having small businesses sustain and growing in the term. That is the superstar of local content. It's not the size of a business, because it doesn't define the quality, but it defines the quality, defines that they can start, continue, and grow to other areas. That is where the rich value of the industry comes when we create that. The other piece that when we work on capacity mapping is creating that data, as I said, infrastructure, and now you go into the demand of the project itself. And this is matched with the risk. There's operational risk that you can take. There are operational risks that you cannot take, and it's based on the capacity of the local level. That might be that if you are in a very isolated area, you might not source locally hazardous materials, or even the transportation of hazardous materials might be something that you don't feel that the man who has a truck that transports cows can do this. And it's not that you don't want to give the job, it's that it becomes a risk issue, becomes a health and safety issue, and becomes a greater component in that map. So when you map capacities, you map the possibilities, and you become realistic about the expectations that can be done. And at the same time, you have very clear understanding where collaboration comes in place, either collaboration with the government, with education institutions, with international organizations with expertise in this. And now all of these links to that social license. And I think that this is a piece that we have to also to be realistic about how far local content can go in getting you the social license. Local content gives you the opportunity of answering the economic component of the social license. But having all of these suppliers engage in your supply chain doesn't mean that the quality of the relationship is there. The relationship, it has to be guarded for many angles. The trust, the legal processes, the hiring and contracting is another piece. The direct employment is another piece. The unions is another piece. The real understanding of your impacts and how you're addressing that is another piece. So the social license is not given by you signing a contract that now you're a local supplier. Is that now you answer one piece, that you are part of the supply chain, that you can benefit from the project somehow, but there are many other elements. And the piece of capacity mapping is just literally understand. And when we have been working on this for clients, is basically to have a real picture of how far you can go, how much help do you need from others, and how much the community can do by itself if we go in a timeline that depends basically on the lifetime of the project and the capacities.
And I think that actually comes back to my earlier point of having both the quantitative and qualitative elements, because I mean, in series of organization, we see obviously the quantitative positive of, creation of jobs, economy, the potentiality for, new business in terms of quantitative data. But despite this, there's a resentment, there are bad relationships, there's trust, there's, extortion or interest that, sometimes are, of criminal nature, especially for the gold, mining sector. But even, I see that in the energy sector more and more. And the idea is to be able to have, move away from the old school local content, which is I put out a tender, which understandably is following international standards, but I'm asking 100 companies to bid for it, which makes it one winner and 99 people that are frustrated and not happy because of the fact that they actually invested in the certification costs or others. It's really much more turning towards an incremental basis of selecting the actors, of working incrementally with them towards more work inside, with the company or inside the sector, but also highlighting with them how they could diversify their operation, that they don't become so dependent on the extractive industry actor. And I think all these—
Remi, if you allow me one last piece that is also critical, and we rarely mention this, and it's a sad reality in the developing world, is that sometimes local content and the idea of building the local supply chains also comes on an ethical component around anti-corruption and money laundering. And sadly, it is happening a lot when we have, for example, artisanal mining in the region. And when we have some drug trafficking happening, it happens a lot in Mexico, for example. So it becomes also part of that screening process of a company who are your suppliers. And because you can easily end up money laundering without even knowing you are part of that black hole.
It's not that I want to cut you. You actually addressed this a little bit in one of the webinars on modern slavery, the lightning with informal activities and others, and we'll have something specifically on security, money laundering, and cartels. So we'll do this later in this webinar series. It's already planned. But I maybe wanted to ask maybe the last 5-10 minutes briefly to just turn to the panelists. Starting with in the order that we did. Gosia, Jeff, Sheila, Laurent, and then Monica. Just maybe for concluded words or ideas, something that we've seen that you wanted to address into the question. And in order to be effective, I'm just going to already thank you everyone for being there, because I understand that some people need to leave since we passed the hour. Gosia, can I turn to you first, maybe just for 2 or 3 sentences?
Sure. So many things. I think the competitiveness, of course, is my kind of special thing that I want to attend. And I think technology is going to be a challenge for many businesses and many of the less developed countries where we're working. And so the inclusiveness that we need to kind of keep in mind as we consider benefit sharing and so on. And so how do we engage with businesses and individuals? Because businesses can only be competitive if they have the workforce to hire to carry out the work that they need to do. So just because we created an enterprise doesn't mean it can hire local people. So we need education and everything. We need TVET, we need technical vocational schools and so on. It all needs to function in order to succeed in local content. And so just a database of enterprises is not a success. And it's only the starting point, which then opens up the Pandora's box of all of the obstacles that we need to tackle in order to make those businesses successful. And yeah, so it's it's daunting and it's overwhelming. And that's my ending. Those are my ending words.
If you want to add up to this, just the database is not enough. How do we build consensus? How we do work as brokers to facilitate agreements? I'm sorry, I'm just shaping your answer. Just go for it.
Yeah, obviously data, but then on top of that, there's a lot of need for mapping. I mean, whether it's the government or a bilateral aid organization, there's a giant need to understand what's already happened. And we see consistently new actors come to a country wanting to help this issue, and they haven't done their homework on what is already in place and what has already happened before. And that's sort of a key piece. You know, there's so much time wasted where companies are recreating the wheel, where aid organizations are recreating the wheel. So I would say, you know, yes, we need the actual data on how much procurement spending is going to what, but we also need some real convening and mapping work done as the basis for any activity.
No, perfect. Thank you for this. Sheila, maybe if you want to jump in and give some of your concluding thoughts. And you're mute, Sheila.
Guess I failed all three. But what I wanted to say is that the one thing we didn't say, which is really problematic, especially in emerging markets, Africa and Latin America, is that if you have two large continents and you are an international operator like Total, and you are in Mozambique, you are in Senegal, you are in Angola or other places, the notion that you must replicate local content everywhere you go, economically, is just counterintuitive. And so I think this is a big problem. And it's very difficult to justify that wherever you go, you start from ground zero. And so I think as we move forward with local content, some thought on a concept of a regional integrated local content, where if you are already doing work in Peru, that you get credit in Argentina when you then start a project there, because you can move goods, not that you can't produce, but that whatever you are doing in Peru can be sourced into part of the larger Latin American community and is seen as part of the local content. I think that is missing. The other thing which I think is missing with local content is, I don't think we must overstate the case for local content. I think we must think of it as value content. And by that I mean, the notion that I have put 80% of something which economically has very little value is a non-starter economically. There are some parts that are very high value, but in terms of the physical and the quantum of the content, they are not. So I think governments need to think about how they define the value of local content. Is it in the sheer numbers, or is it in the economic value of the component part, which then in the end creates a greater multiplier effect? My sense is that we have become stuck with the number of things rather than the value of things. And so this is a challenge to you, Remi, since you are the academic. You can go and do research and look at that. I can just ask the question, but I do think that policymakers need to be helped to think about it, because I think they've been stuck in this 30-year stage, and somebody needs to help them, because in truth, this train is not getting anywhere.
No, thank you. By the way, I'm the old academic. I'm not an academic for the last 7 to 8 years. I'm just doing a little teaching at HEC Paris on the side of Miami. So I can't, but I will definitely ask this student of mine to just maybe look into this. That might be the best way to do this. So you made a great point on Total. I just wish we had someone here on this panel that could probably answer your question. Laurent, I'm going for you. That's also a very soft ball for you. It seems like we have reversed this, but I think the agreement on, for example, in Mozambique with Linhari Yaji Mozambique, the local airlines, and the capacity for them to just, talk, just also open new markets along those lines of other, Total projects in Africa goes along that way. But how you would maybe answer to Sheila's question, and then we'll finish up with Monica.
I very much appreciated what Sheila said about working on value, because this is what matters, and I would say sustainable value, because we can be entrenched, in demands along the supply chain without a succession of projects afterwards, and the capacity which is built is not sustainable. And then it's like pouring money out of the windows. Huh? And so sometimes we should consider being more open-minded and consider projects which are outside of the supply chains. Why not in agriculture? We know it's sustainable and it makes sense, but this is possible only if you have an objective analysis of the local capacities and what can be done and what should be done and what should not be done because it's not sustainable. If you align with the authorities and probably with all the major stakeholders and you build trust is a key element. If there is no trust, there's no long-term ambition. You do not act on the long term, and you end up into short-term tactical operations and just figures. No, this is not this is not the important point. There's a lot of goodwill. So where's the goodwill? You know, it's a question of collaborating. Yep. If you want to create local capacity and develop local capacities, it's a matter of aligning the goodwill, and that's very important. How do you create goodwill? And finally, digitalization. To come back to my last point, that creates value for all the reasons I mentioned. But I very much appreciated what Sheila said about value. It's about sustainable value, basically.
It's about sustainable value. It's about lasting collaborations. It's about being able to seal down the right agreements which are balanced and get towards the long-term future, and then following up on the step-by-step implementation and transparency of those agreements. I mean, I'm turning towards you, Monica. Just basically you have the last minute to just give us the solution on local content. That's what everyone is asking for. That was just an introduction to that, one or two sentence conclusion on your side, and then I'll close up afterwards. Don't worry, please, Monica.
Well, thank you, Remy. Well, the solution I think is a work of many. So I will invite everybody on that solution. But basically, I will say that going back to that value creation is the purpose of this is give opportunities, and value are behind every single opportunity we can give. And one of the things that human beings, all of us, regardless the condition, our level of education, that we appreciate is when an opportunity is granted. And that's what local content is. We want to give an opportunity for a better education. We want to give an opportunity for local players to be part of that. We want to give an opportunity for the industry to come and bring this big machine that multiply effect. We want to give opportunity for the government to also be part of that game. So I think that local content, for me at least, is equals multiplying opportunities.
No, thank you, Monica. And for more information on example or best practices or cases, I'm just realizing, the webinar that we had 2 weeks ago with Mina Cobre Panama and UNICEF was actually dealing a lot onto this capacity to create more economic values and cross-sectoral collaboration. For example, the relation with the agricultural sector, where the tomato paste was then taken by Nestle in Panama, so that created a collaboration between Nestle and a mining company towards the export of a local good. There are plenty of best case practices. I wish we had 75 hours to talk about this. We don't, and probably you'll be completely bored with me. But please send additional questions. We usually have transcripts and video of these, so reach out to me and I'll share them broadly. And I really wanted to thank our panelists from all across the world to discuss this issue. This is probably just one of many other webinars on local content, but we'll welcome the questions and we'll follow up with additional events. Thank you very much to all of you. I wish you a very good end of week, and I'll see you probably in 2 weeks for the next webinar, which is going to be on sustainable mining in Ecuador, and then we have social performance coming. So yes,
okay.
Thank
you very much. Thank you, Remy.
Yes.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.